to the book of James, if you will. We're starting a new series. The series I'm calling Daily Faith, because James is intensely practical, and I don't want to take the time this morning to survey the book of James, but if you know anything about the book of James, it's extremely practical. Some people call it the Proverbs in the New Testament. Although it feels different than Proverbs, and it certainly in terms of genre is different, the practicality of the book leads people to say that it has that same impact as the book of Proverbs. In fact, in James, he's going to talk about things as practical as prejudice, speech and the way we talk, conflicts in the church, dealing with money. I mean, these are the kinds of practical things that seem to be the purpose of James, to write these believers who had scattered to different places because of persecution. This is to whom James writes. They know the difficulty of trials. They know the difficulty of loss and disappointment because of their very lives. Persecution upon Christians in this very early time of New Testament development had taken place, and Christians were now beginning to relocate based on their own experience of persecution. James writes a letter. James, the brother of the Lord, half-brother of Judas. So we have sort of a connection between James and the Holy Family and another book in the New Testament. So this is coming from somebody that everybody who's a Christian would honor for good reasons. Brother of the Lord. But he also was an influential player in the church of Jerusalem. If you read the book of Acts, you see that James took sort of a seat of primacy, not an official one, not because he was installed as an officer. That came later in the church mess. But early on, he was just a leader in the church, and as a brother of the Lord, he took, and I think because of who he was, he took a prime role in some of the theological discussions that took place that you read about in Acts chapter 15 and other places. Some have said that James exemplifies what's called the primus inter pares, the first among equals. There were others who were apostles. There were others who had more experience and connection with the Christian movement than him, but he was sort of a first among equals by way of his influence. So he writes this letter. One of the things that James talks about that I didn't mention is trials, and that's what we're going to look at today. We're only going to cover verses 2 through 4. Why trials? Well, I already mentioned that the audience to whom James writes is referred to sometimes as the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora. That means the scattering. And if you read the book of Acts, you know why they scattered. They scattered because of persecution. And so James writes to them, and right off the bat, talks about how they should respond when things go bad. Because things were going bad. And as you read it, the way James talks, it's almost as if he wants to answer the question that someone, as a believer, might ask, what in the world is going on? I came to faith in Christ, and my life seems to be falling apart. And maybe it's just a natural expectation we have, that if I become a believer, all the pieces will fall together. The sun will shine, the birds will sing, the clouds will be in the air, and Jesus will just take care of everything. The fact of the matter is, the experience of believers has not quite been like that. It was not the experience of these believers and Christians. It's not the experience of you either. And so sometimes we just sort of wonder, I thought, as a Christian, that God would just sort of intervene and rasp off the rough edges of my experience, and then things get a little worse. And then we hear preachers and popular teachers who seem to suggest that if you have enough faith, nothing will go bad. God doesn't want you to suffer. He doesn't want you to live in want. He doesn't want you to live in poverty. He doesn't want you to fail in your life, whatever that means. He wants you to be successful and happy and prosperous. And you listen to all of that, and you say, well, what am I doing wrong? James seems to want to answer that question. Maybe not if it's asked that way. But let's listen to what he says. He says, brothers, or my brothers, consider it a great joy whenever you experience trial. You know, I already have questions when I read something like that. Maybe we'll hit them. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete and lacking nothing. Well, I guess in an apologetic way, James doesn't answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? He doesn't go there. He doesn't solve all of the mysteries involved in wondering why me and why now and why God, which is where we usually go whenever things happen. Instead, he seems to kind of come in the back door and he says, okay, so things are bad. Remember, he's writing Jews who scattered because of persecution. So things are bad. He said, I want you to consider it a great joy. That seems a little complicated. In this, what I see James telling us to do is how, first of all, we need to think about trials, and then secondly, how we need to respond to trials. And the outline on the back of your notes may reflect what I say today, perhaps. When we see James saying that you're going to experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, we have to ask the question, what is a trial? I mean, what constitutes a trial? It's the Greek word parasmos, plural parasmois, and it's translated a couple of different ways. I think that the most generic use of the word, and the one that's the most common certainly in the New Testament, is a testing, sort of a trying. But it also can refer to a temptation, because whenever we go through a time of testing and a time of difficulty, one of the possible responses of the person going through the difficulty, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, is to do what? He may be tempted to respond badly. A part of testing may be temptation, so that I see temptation as sort of a semantic subset of the broader word testing. And James, I think, here is being very broad. Now, later in the chapter, he talks about temptation, which cannot come from God, and he uses the same word. So this word can have the semantic specificity to just talk about temptation. But for now, I see James talking generally about going through tests. Things that happen in our lives that God uses to prove the quality of our character and the quality of our faith. So it's very possible that both meanings are sort of running around here, because a trial is a difficulty that proves us, but if it's handled wrongly, then man might abandon trust in God. In fact, Robertson wrote this, trials rightly faced are harmless, but wrongly met become temptations to evil. So both of them are kind of there. But I think James starts this out just by talking generally and sort of generically about tests that everyone goes through. See, Christians, you probably already found this, but we have the same insurance rates as unbelievers. There's no special deal because you're a Christian. Wouldn't you love it if your insurance man said, oh, you're a Christian? Well, that'll be half price. And by the way, if you have that agent, please give him my number. But you don't. That doesn't happen. And God uses the tests that we go through. How he orchestrates them and what his engagement is in orchestrating all of that, I'll leave, for minds greater than mine. And James doesn't really take that on here. He just says that when you go through it, there's a right way to think about this. Now, he calls them various trials. When you go through various trials in your life, you should consider them all joy. And I appreciate that, because James isn't locking this down to one particular thing. When we think about the Jews of the diaspora who were kind of scattered abroad, we might think, well, then this test that he's talking about is just persecution. And it may involve persecution, but he's being more broad than that, and he seems to be doing it on purpose. He wants to just talk about general tests that we experience. And you can think about all kinds. Certainly there's persecution. There's loss. There's disappointment. There's physical pain. What about a milder version of persecution? Just personal abuse. I mean, we could go on and on all day about various kinds of trials, and James wants us to put all of them in the category of our new consideration. This is what he wants to talk about. By the way, you fall into these. He says when you fall into various tests, you should consider them as great joy. I think it's just a colorful way to talk about the experience that we all have. It's the same word that's used to talk in the story of the Good Samaritan about him falling among thieves. When we fall among these tests that come along in life too. And he talks about it as though it's rather tendential. It's kind of normative for us to fall into these tests. And isn't that your experience? Maybe there are seasons Have you ever seen someone who just seemed to have a difficulty and then another one, and you go, my goodness, they just got the truckload dumped on them. And we've all known people like that, and maybe you've gone through a season like that too. They've fallen into those tests. By the way, being in the fallen world just is a context for trouble. It is. That's why we all have the same insurance rates. In fact, even in Jesus' life. John chapter 11 said that Jesus was troubled in his spirit when he got to Lazarus. And very clearly it says that he was troubled when he saw Mary and Martha crying, and when he saw the crying of the Jews around him. Then he was troubled deeply in his spirit. Jesus, of course, he was the one who said, look, Lazarus is asleep. I'm going to go and I'm going to wake him up. He knew that death was not the ultimate reality for Lazarus, but being in the context of the pain and the confusion and the loss that people experience in a fallen world, even wrote chapter 11 and verse 35, Jesus wept. Another passage, also in John, I think it says that Jesus was troubled in his spirit because he knew one of them was going to betray him. The reality of Judas, who was going to betray him with a kiss, caused Jesus to anguish in his spirit as well. Being in a fallen world is itself a context for trouble, which is one reason that it doesn't make any sense for us to say, why me? And we tend to do that, why me? Well, it's really all of us. You're feeling it now, but we all go through trouble in this world in varying degrees. So, a trial. It's a difficulty that proves us. It's a difficulty that brings out the real character of our faith. And James is going to say that it has a particular purpose and trajectory in the life of a believer. And our call is to let it happen. What do we need to know about trials? Verse 3, again. I think I'm ahead of myself. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Well, first of all, it's a testing. This word testing, by the way, is different than the other word, trial. And it's the Greek word, dokimon, and it's a proof. James talking in this book about proofs of genuine faith. I mean, later he's going to say, if you say that you have faith but you don't have works, then your faith is dead. There's nothing really happening there. I mean, it's sort of a theme for James to talk about authenticity and to talk about genuineness and about faith that really produces and really yields. And he opens with the salvo about this very issue, saying, look, what God is doing in your life is proving what is real. And that's one of the reasons he offers for seeing it as a great joy, as hard as that might be to take in. So what we need to know about these trials is that, first of all, they are a testing. They're a proving of our character. Secondly, they're a test of our faith. Basically, our view of God is on the block when we're in a trial. There's always, even to our physical loss, there's a spiritual dimension, always. Sometimes I think in our discussions we're trying to part out too harshly what's a spiritual and what's a biophysical trial. We're unified beings. And by the way, if you understand Christian theology, there's a rather dynamic connection between our bodies and our souls in Christian theology. We're not Gnostics. And when someone goes through a time of physical suffering, the soul is sort of pulled along sometimes into anguish. And we all have friends, we see them when they're in physical suffering, and the very nature of their character changes sometimes. There is a connection between body and soul, so that when our body suffers, spiritually we have profound questions. It's really the work of a chaplain. The chaplain goes from room to room, even in the broadest sort of interfaith sense. A chaplain is taught, you need to go in and find out where the patient is feeling, here's the phrase that pays, spiritual distress. You say, I'm in a hospital. They're feeling physical distress. Yeah, they're also feeling physical or spiritual distress. Why? Because the patient just found out he's losing his arm, and it's a loss. And a sense of loss is a spiritual thing. It's not a physical thing. The arm is a physical thing. The sense of loss is a spiritual reality. Everybody who goes through physical trials and testings and hurt, and pain, and even physical aspects of loss entail necessarily spiritual realities that we as Christians are asked. So, what's happening here with these trials is a testing, but it's also a testing of our faith. It's always appropriate. It's not always done appropriately, but it's always appropriate when someone's going through trials to ask them spiritual questions about how they perceive what's happening and how they perceive what God is doing and how they perceive where they go from here spiritually. That's always appropriate. Now, the asker isn't always so wise. You know, it's not always best when someone goes through loss to go up and quote them, a passage of Romans. You might want to ease into that and find the right time. But these spiritual questions are the right stuff. I always laughed when I'd be in a hospital room and somebody would tell me, "Oh, chaplain, I'm not a spiritual person. I don't really have a spiritual life, and I don't think about spiritual things." And then they'd go on to talk to me about sensations of loss and emptiness and loneliness and despair. And I want to say, what do you think, that's physical? You think you can take despair and put it in a test tube and boil it over a low flame? It's not physical. It is spiritual. So they say, "Oh, I'm not spiritual." And then they launch into this long discussion about their spiritual journey. People don't even realize the spiritual aspect of their own suffering. And James says, Christians, remember, when we go through this, we have a dimension that we can massage and we can play with because we're spiritually alive in Christ. God bless their hearts. The unbeliever doesn't even know what to do with it. They deny it's even there. Wow. So that's what we need to know about trials. Now, what do we need to think about trials? Let's go back to verse 2 again. Consider it a great joy. This consider it is a verb of thought, not a verb of emotion. I know that's hard for Christians a lot of times. But he says, I want you to think differently. This is actually a big deal in the New Testament, right? We're transformed Christians by the renewing of our what? Our minds. Paul doesn't say you need to be transformed by the renewing of our emotions. Why? Because emotions follow minds, not vice versa. And if you try to reverse that process, you create quite a mess. James pulls on that here and he says we need to consider it great joy. This is an aorist verb here that probably has the idea of a settled conviction. What it means to do is to evaluate something. And he gives a command to consider it a joy. Why does he command you to consider your difficulty a joy? Because it's not your first reaction. That's why. That's not how I approach my trials. I look at it and I say, this stinks. That's my first reaction. And then, if I let my mind wander a little bit, I might say, and if I was God, I wouldn't have done it this way. I probably don't say that out loud. But I think it. And James says, look, the fact is you need to consider it a great joy. It's a call to engage the mind in difficulty. Now, think about some of these examples. Jesus, Hebrews says, for the joy set before him endured the cross. There is no joy in the cross. But he endured the suffering, despised the shame, for the joy set before him. You see, there was a purpose for the cross beyond the experience itself. So Jesus modeled this himself. Paul and Silas, sitting in a jail in Philippi. They sat there in shackles, perhaps heading to martyrdom, and sang some hymns. That's not probably what we would do. Well, why did he do that? Well, Paul was the one who, writing to the Philippians, said, I've learned, whatever state I'm in, to be content. Whether I have money, whether I don't have money, whether I'm poor, whether I'm rich. I've learned the secret of being content. Paul said he could learn that because he saw something bigger about where he was going and what God was doing in his life. It wasn't about my current state. There was something bigger about what God is doing. The fact is, when we're going through trials, we are at a crossroads. Now, there's more to it than this, but let's just stop here and consider that we're at a crossroads when we're going through trials. You have one of a couple of different options. You can consider it a joy because God's doing a work and he's still present in my life. Or you can pull back spiritually. I think believers sometimes do this for a season. I don't think they'll stay there. I don't think a real Christian will stay there in bitterness. But you might for a while. So you look at that moment of loss. I've been here. I remember a particular loss in life of Jan and myself. And I remember a moment of crystal clarity where I realized this is the moment. This is the thing everybody talks about. Right now, because of this horrible loss, I can either say, I don't understand, but God is here, or I can say, I'm bitter, I'm out. It was so clear. By the way, I think that's one of the reasons why we consider it a joy. Why consider it a joy? Well, first of all, because in spiritual awareness, or in times of trials, spiritual awareness can be heightened. Why is that? Why is it when you're going through your hardest times, your thoughts and your perceptions about God and what He's doing can be the most profound? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. These trials force us to think through a moment and focus on what trusting God means. And sure, you can walk away, but if you don't, then you stay there and you gain some new clarity and new depth. And many times, you'll never be the same person. But another reason that James gives is that we consider it joy because the fact is that these trials produce endurance. He says these trials produce endurance. By the way, it's not patience. There are a few translations that call it patience. Patience is makrothumia. And that's not the idea here. The idea is hupomone. This idea is perseverance or endurance. God's work is to generate faithful endurance in His own people. That is what He does as He walks with us through trials and difficulties and loss and hurts. He generates endurance, a strong and a powerful soul. It may not feel like it at the moment, but that's His program. That's what He's doing. James is calling us to recognize that in our lives. By the way, Jesus said in John 8 that if you abide in my word, then you really are my disciples. It is a quality of genuine faith to endure through trials. There's something anomalous, something abnormal about the believer who comes to a trial and then wanders from the faith. There's something unnormal and unnatural about that. And that person will live their life feeling wrong and uncomfortable and disjointed and not know how to move forward because they're not living like who they are. The program of God in our lives is to generate faithful endurance that perseveres through the worst of times. That's what He's doing in your life, Christian. For that reason, in verse 4, James talks about how we should respond to trials. Let endurance have its full effect so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. So here he talks about persistent faith. Let this endurance, this ability to persevere, this hupomone, he says, let it have its full effect. This is an active imperative, and the idea is that you need to let God do His work in you. Let God do what He's doing. Don't kick against what God is doing. There's so many ways to kick against that and stall out by questions that nobody can answer. Why? 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 And I know that's natural, and you got to give people some breathing room. But after a while, when things have settled, Christian, there's no more reason to ask why, because you're the kind that trusts your God. Because that's who you are. That's what faith in God means. It means when I don't have all the answers, I still know He is God. That is what faith is. Everything else was practice. And this is the moment when I don't have the answers. That's the moment to say, what do I really believe now? Everything else is just background noise. Now we really find out the testing of our character in those moments. We respond with a persistent faith, but it's also a productive faith. He says, let the process complete. Let it have its full effect. And there he uses a word, let it reach, or let it have its perfect work. The Greek word is actually work. There actually is a work in our trials. God is doing something in our trials. We become exhausted when we tend to see difficulties as pointless. But God redeems our trials and our time to achieve His ends. And that demands a degree of faith too, and recognition that God is always active in my life even when things go bad. He's doing a work, and James says, let that work come to completion. The Greek word there is teleon. He's saying allow endurance to do all it's intended to do in your life. It's the idea of completion. By the way, the opposite would be to shut down the growth process in the trial. James says, God's wanting to bring you to a point of relative maturity in your life. To be all grown up spiritually, that's what the word means. And you can't shut that down how? By bitterness, right? By anger? Or just by lethargy? There are all kinds of ways to fight against what God is doing. But what God is trying to do, of course, Christians, is grow us up in the difficulty. You know, it's kind of cute when kids aren't grown up. You have the grandkids over and the things they do and the things they say. They can't pronounce the things right. And then you start doing it. We still have words that my son said when he was this big. He doesn't even remember that. But we still say those words wrong. Just for fun. Because it's cute when they're little. But if he's 40 and he still says those things, there's something weird about that. There's something odd about it. Because it should have matured by now. Sometimes you have Christians like that. Because of bitterness, they stall out and they pull back whenever things don't go their way. They just act as though God's not there and don't trust Him through the moment. Here they are now. They've walked with the Lord, bless their hearts, for 30 years. Still whining and screaming and kicking tantrums on the floor. There's something distasteful about that when you see it. An adult shouldn't be that way. And James is reminding us that God, through these things, wants to grow us up. He says, do this so that you may be mature and complete and lacking nothing. This word mature is the same word that we previously used for a perfect work, but when it speaks of people, it really does speak of relative maturity and speak of a full-grownness. The word complete is interesting. It's two Greek words that means all parts. We actually get the word holographic from this word. It's a visual of something that shows all the parts, and you can see all the parts. That's what God is trying to do in us. He's trying to make us mature and complete in all of the parts. And if you don't know what that means, then he says, lacking nothing. It's the meaning of complete stated negatively. Maybe you wouldn't do it this way. Maybe you wouldn't allow this thing to come into your life. You know, you're not God. But I do know when you came to Jesus Christ and trusted Him as Savior, then in those early moments you said, I don't have all the answers, and so I'm trusting you for the things I can't do. I'm trusting you for the things I can't know. And then the trial comes, and you pull back. Christians, maybe we just need a reminder. He's still there. There's no reason to pull back. Actually, God will take this thing and this dry, barren desert you've been going through and cause a little plant to grow in the cracks of the ground. Only He can do that. I always like to say that sovereignty, though it's other things, is well stated. That sovereignty means that nothing is so awful that God can't use it for His own purposes. And sometimes we go through things that seem just really awful. You're in a program. God wants to do this work in your hearts. Let's pray together.